Today is the anniversary of the Challenger Space Shuttle disaster, and we're releasing our encore episode, the most popular episode of 2024 on Spotify, with engineering professor and author Phil Rosenkrantz. And we're going to be discussing the ethics, the engineering, and the business, all behind this one day that no Gen Xer will ever forget.
And they kicked all the engineers out of the room before they took the vote on whether or not to launch.
You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolske.
And I'm Rudy Salo.
And this is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, all with the aim of a more knowledgeable life, a happy life. And today's episode, this is a sobering episode. A lot of you might be learning what you didn't know. We're going all the way back to 1986, and we were talking about the Challenger disaster with author, engineering professor, and guest of the pod for the second time, Phil Rosenkrantz. Rudy, what did you get out of this episode? What did you learn?
Well, I think it's actually relevant to my question, Gwen. It being 2024, why would we still be talking about this? Well, what's the relevance of this to a philosophy podcast like ours?
If I can nerd out for a second,
I'm asking you to nerd out. If you haven't figured that out, I'm asking you to nerd out. So our audience, I'm sure everybody would love to hear
what they come here for.
What our spin on this is, but why is this relevant to our show?
There's two things that come to mind. I think it's actually perfect that this episode follows the one that we did with Dr. Angela Gorell on decisions, because that was about personal decisions and things that are involved in what makes them difficult. And I had been thinking about the pressure of what other people think. And then we're following it up with this episode with Professor Rosenkrantz talking about a decision to launch something that the engineers knew would fail. And what was part of that decision? It was the business pressure. It was the political pressure. So when we're talking about the Challenger Space Shuttle disaster, we're not talking about just a technical failure. We're talking about a massive ethical failure and a terrible decision in the face of all of the evidence. So some of the things that we learn from this disaster is, first of all, the significance of informed consent. The astronauts were not informed that there was a problem. It was not illegal at the time. It is illegal now. But another thing is that when you have the data and you have experts in your face, and you have not experienced what it is that they are telling you, because it's just numbers. It feels like it's just numbers. That how it is that we yield to expertise instead of the motivation when it comes to business and politics. Now, Rudy, you and I are not anti-money. Hell, I'll even accept a bribe. But, we're just kidding. All right. But we are not anti-money. The thing is that money is can be the byproduct of excellence. And you want to aim for excellence. And that is the point of space exploration. And what happened was the aim turned into one that had to do with money. And when you swap out money for excellence, you have a very big problem instead of aiming for excellence and then allowing the money to be the byproduct. What do you think?
Well said, Gwen. Gwen, well said. I think you really articulated why we're talking about this episode now. The ethical dilemmas, the influences, political influence, financial influence, NASA being worried about, funding and other types of, governmental pressure, governmental contracts, how we do things in this country. That's the reason why we're talking about the horrible Challenger disaster still to this day, because lessons can be learned and we can get better from these lessons, and we can become and live a better life by looking to the past.
Okay, so it's 1986, everybody. We're talking about the Challenger disaster with professor and author Phil Rosenkrantz. Phil, welcome back to Good is in the Details. I'm really excited to talk to you about the Challenger. You're an engineering professor. I was thinking about the Challenger disaster because I was thinking about how unique it was for Gen X, because if you were born between 65 to 80, so Gen X, that means every Gen Xer was in school and saw, that's something we all have in common for this generation. We all saw that happen. And a lot of people to this day still do not know what made it so tragic and a disaster is the fact that it didn't have to happen. And so I was just wondering if you could give us some background on what happened with what was going on behind the scenes with the Challenger Space Shuttle disaster.
Sure, I can do that. You're exactly right. It didn't have to happen. It shouldn't have happened, and it almost didn't happen. The reason that the space shuttle exploded was because of O-rings on the rocket boosters that were not sealing during liftoff. So hot gases leaked out, hit the main rocket, and then blew it up. So that's the physical thing that happened. But why it happened is because the O-rings didn't work good at low temperatures, and the launch temperature was below freezing, which was very rare for Florida and hadn't happened before. This was the 25th launch of the space shuttle. The O-rings just couldn't, they were too brittle to seal, and so it blew up. Now, why did they launch in cold weather is what the whole thing is all about. The engineers, when they heard what the temperature was in Florida, freaked out, and the engineer that was there wanted to make sure they didn't launch, and he called for a teleconference between NASA and the rocket booster company, which was Morton Thiokol. And that's who the engineers worked for. And they campaigned to cancel the launch. But there was too much pressure to launch from NASA because of the timing. That's what a lot of this is all about. The teacher in space. They wanted to launch so that kids could watch it, and then that night or the next night, President Reagan could stand up at the State of the Union message and have a feather in his cap. And so there was a lot of pressure to launch, and management overrode the engineers. And so that's part of the behind the scenes. And then the other behind the scenes was the attempt to try and cover that up, and the whistleblowers that came out of the woodwork. There's so many lessons in this case that I could tell you about, which makes it, in my opinion, one of the premier cases that engineers study when it comes to ethics and things to watch out for and stuff like that. So that's the background.
Now, with this O-ring problem, how long did the engineers know that it was problematic? Because I think I vaguely remember that there was a letter written about problems with it like in the 70s. And the Challenger, for everybody, that happened in 86.
Happened in 86. In 85, an engineer, Roger Beaujolais, who's a main player in this whole case, they had a low temperature launch at 53 degrees. Most of the launches in Florida were, in the 70 degree range. And a 53 degree launch, when they retrieved the booster rockets and took them apart to replace the O-rings, they saw a lot of blow-by. And so that got Roger Beaujolais and the other engineers he worked with concerned about the O-ring as a design flaw. And so, yes, he wrote a very pointed letter, which specifically talked about loss of life, sent that all the way up the chain of command. He followed, the procedures for that. They created an O-ring committee, so to speak, to investigate it. But it was really one of those situations in management where one of the ways that you are able to sidetrack something is you create a committee to study it and then never have any committee activity. And so Roger Beaujolais kept expressing his concerns. Director of the rocket booster, Alan McDonald, was the engineer that was at Cape Canaveral for the launch, and he's the one that said needed to try and stop it and called for the teleconference. So yes, there was awareness of it. NASA was aware of it. And there was an analyst named Richard C. Cook who was writing letters to NASA about, hey, if this O-ring thing is ever, goes bad, we're going to be in deep pucky. Then he's the one that after it blew up, he secretly sent documents to, I think it was the New York Times, as a whistleblower that helped kind of raise the awareness of what had happened. There were other incidents too.
This was
But,
this also changed the definition of whistleblower because philosophers love definitions. But a whistleblower technically has to do something that is going to prevent immediate harm and to the public. And we have a whistleblower in this situation. We want to say they're a whistleblower, but they don't fit that definition. So the definition had to be expanded in order to include what happened. Now, what I would love to know is if we were a fly on the wall for that conference the night before the launch, what would we have heard?
You had the engineers pointing at photographs of the O-ring and saying that it's too cold to launch. But you had the person who was handling the call from NASA, a guy named Larry Malloy, who was hell-bent to launch, saying that Morton Thiokol didn't really have any engineering evidence that the O-rings would fail. They didn't have any engineering data. He kept saying, where's your engineering data? And they're pointing at photographs. They didn't have the right kinds of charts and graphs to influence Larry Malloy, but he probably would have poo-pooed anything they had anyway because he was hell-bent to launch. So you saw engineers that were saying don't launch. You had Larry Malloy challenging them. But here's where I think the big plank in the eye was, and that was Morton Thiokol's management. They were so afraid of canceling the launch and losing future contracts. The director of engineering made a comment to the engineering manager, take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. And then he changed his mind from being against the launch to saying it was okay to launch.
From what I understand, you have to prove that it is safe. But in this
That's
situation,
right.
They were like, prove that it will fail. But they
That's right. And
they hadn't blown anyone up before. So there wasn't.
This reversal in tactics caught them with their pants down. They didn't know how to handle it, and they didn't know what was going on. And so the engineering managers just acquiesced, and they kicked all the engineers out of the room before they took the vote on whether or not to launch. Alan McDonald, who was at Florida, he was supposed to sign off to approve the launch, and he refused to do it. So his boss said, okay, I'll override him and sign off on it. So the fly on the wall would have seen very strong arguments about not launching, and then would have seen Larry Malloy just persistently attacking all the evidence. That didn't all look good when it all came out later.
Could you, let's say for people who are younger, the millennials and the Gen Z, why, in your opinion, Phil, was this such a big deal? Like, why was this such a cultural moment?
It was a cultural moment, but the reason that it happened was because the history of the Space Shuttle program was filled with delays and overruns. Congress was getting increasingly opposed to the Space Shuttle program and funding it. And so the White House created the Teacher in Space program as a way to try and inspire more interest in space. This was a big deal in trying to preserve the space program. We had kind of gotten out of the era of the 60s, where it was a space race against the Russians, who could get to the moon first and all that. Now we were into the Space Shuttle program, which people were looking at calling it. The media was really on top of, kind of hounding the Space Shuttle program, calling it a space bus and they can't launch on time, and just a lot of hassle. So the media was a big factor. The media hype was. The Teacher in Space was an attempt to try and get the younger generation and everybody more interested in what could be done in space, why we're doing it. Another big issue that came out of all of this, and when we start to talk about what was the aftermath, was the concept of informed consent. The astronauts didn't know anything about the O-rings, or they actually didn't know anything much about any of the hundreds of safety concerns on the space shuttle. On any system, there are potential failures. Some of the failures don't have any backup, and those are the ones you're really concerned about because, you don't have any kind of protection. But the astronauts were trusting that the engineers at NASA and all the subcontractors were doing a good job, and part of it was because they had been lulled into a false sense of security because there hadn't been any space side failures. There had been disasters, like when the 3 astronauts died on the ground during a test because of the fire that burned with too much oxygen. And Apollo 13, they had that problem in space, but they managed to get down safely, So people were kind of lulled into a false sense of security as well. And that same false sense of security came back with the Columbia when it burned up on re-entry in 2003. It was the Challenger all over again because they knew they had a problem. They were going back and forth about what to do about it. And finally, somebody made a decision. Well, it's okay. We'll turns out it wasn't okay.
I sent Rudy a video just to kind of like give a recap. And Rudy, that video that I sent you, it was on the Challenger. I was teaching a class called Science, Technology, and Society, and we're going to talk about the Challenger. And I showed that video that I sent you, Rudy. So it's, like one of those 20-minute like mini docs that the New York Times put together. And I'm showing it in class, and I can never show it again because I started to tear up. Now, for the students, they didn't really get it. But then me knowing what I know, that this debate was happening behind the scenes, and the astronauts got on that space shuttle having no idea that the night before the engineers are saying this will not work. And then I'm watching the video and seeing them wave to the crowd, and I started to tear up. And I was like, I can't see this. Because, some people will say, well, space exploration is dangerous anyway. Yes, but this is different. This is the engineer saying, like, it's like getting into a car for racing or something like that. You know that there's some danger, but there's a difference between that and somebody knowing that the car is going to explode. Like when you get into it, that's not quite the same thing. And I think that's what really gets me is the fact that those astronauts and everybody watching stepped on there having no idea that it wasn't going to work.
Yeah, I had the kind of the same reaction. I kind of choked up a little bit, especially when they started talking about the school teacher, especially that particular school teacher. She's actually an Arab American. She's one of the famous Arab Americans. She's like part of her family is part of the northeastern side that had originally immigrated back in the late 1800s, 1900s. So it's kind of an interesting tie to, things that I care about. What was strange though was not to change topics in any way, shape, or form. I feel like this is a part of it. But Gwen, when they showed the second disaster, I strangely didn't have the same reaction. Now, that second disaster was almost 20 or so years later, and I was a much older individual. Whereas the Challenger, we were kids, we were in the third grade. It's a memory burned in my brain that will always be there for a very, very, very long time. And I think the connection is there is something about being a kid and hearing about it, and while being in school and hearing about a school teacher, burning up in space. I feel like I remembered watching some like TV programs about her leading up to her going on to the Challenger. Like I felt like there was some specials about how she got picked and everything. And it was a really amazing, sad story. And I guess that was, how do I say this? It's not the same thing, right? But I know everybody remembers of the baby boomer generation when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I feel like Challenger is similar for us. Yes, we've clearly lived somewhat of a privileged life as Gen Xers. Although if you go back and you look at memes, growing up the way we grew up, things were definitely more dangerous for us. But still, like that was the kind of memory that this had for me. I don't know if it was the same for you.
I remember, I was actually kind of curious about each of our memories. I know for me that I distinctly remember sitting down crisscross, the TV's wheeled in and we're watching it. And then I remember just not understanding it, just being a couple of minutes. And then hearing people in the hallway, like our teacher stepped out of the room and I can remember hearing the teachers crying in the hallway. And then I remember coming home from school and my mom was sitting in front of the television and she was sniffling and she had tissue and she was crying. That's what stands out to me. And I remember I liked watching Punky Brewster. Remember that show? They did an episode where the whole storyline was that Punky Brewster wanted to be an astronaut, but now she didn't want to anymore. And they were trying to make her feel like it was going to be okay. So it was such a big moment. But Phil, let's hear your memory of when you heard about the Challenger. Where were you? What were you doing?
I remember exactly where I was. I was on the elevator in the engineering building going up to teach a class, and a student stepped in the elevator and said, "Hey, did you hear what happened with the space shuttle?" And the people in the elevator said, "No." And he said, "It blew up," and he stepped out of the elevator.
Oh my goodness.
And so I walked into class and I held the class, but I don't think any of us were really paying much attention to what we were doing.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, the traumatic effect on millions of children from this was another big part of this whole case. Can you think of any other incident where, I don't know, maybe Pearl Harbor might be an exception, but can you think of any other incident like this where the public watched in horror as it happened? I mean, it's remarkable in that way. this case has so many facets to it. That's what makes it such a great case to use in the classroom to talk about ethics and why things happen, et cetera, et cetera. And also engineering design comes into this too.
So since I do the ethical theory side of this, I'll ask the students, the engineering students, we'll use Aristotle here because Aristotle says that there is an aim for things. When we say that something's good, that means it achieved its aim. So I ask the students, what is the aim of space exploration? And, we kind of go around and some will say money, defense, maybe finding other things. And I say, okay, now let's just imagine that in a world where, let's say there's no more war, there's no more famine. Like nothing. We don't need military or anything like that. We have everything we need. Would we still do space exploration? And the answer is always yes. And I say, well, why? And it's for knowledge. It's for excellence. We're always going to want to do more and learn more and go further. And so once we understand that that is the aim of space exploration, then everything else should be for that aim. And the problem with the Challenger disaster is that the aim was, like you said, the political and the business pressure. The aim was off. That's not actually the aim of space exploration. That's the wonderful byproduct, but it's not the aim. And so I always say, like, if you walk out of talking about the Challenger disaster and you say, I know what happened, it was the O-rings, you're missing it. It was the decision to launch. Yes. That was the ethical problem.
Yes.
How did the laws change as a result of this?
In terms of engineering, there's been a stronger emphasis on engineers being able to have more influence. Some engineers, if they felt that if they were to come out or object to it or fight for something they know is unsafe, that it might hurt their job or get them fired. But the professional engineering registration, I shouldn't say professional engineering registration. Let's say the Engineering Code of Ethics, how about that, says that safety is paramount. And there's a whole long list of things you should or should not do. So that has been more emphasized since the space shuttle. Another case that was real instrumental in that was the Hyatt Regency walkway collapse. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you were old enough to remember that.
Can you talk a little about that, Phil? Because frankly, it's triggering a little bit in my memory, just as an infrastructure finance attorney. But if you could talk a little bit more about it, that'd be really interesting.
Yes. I think it was in the early 80s. They built a Hyatt Regency hotel in Kansas City. And it had walkways that were suspended from the ceiling by metal rods. In the atrium down below, so the walkways were at the second floor and the fourth floor. And it had a huge atrium, which was kind of a Hyatt Regency thing at all their hotels. There was a Saturday night party going on with hundreds of people down on the ground floor, but there were also hundreds of people on the second and fourth floor walkways looking down. The rods that were holding them up gave way, and those two walkways collapsed, and it killed 111 people and injured 200 people. Why did those walkways collapse? This is so sad. The original design had 4 or 5 rods coming down from the ceiling and attaching the walkways at the second and fourth floor. The builder said those rods would be too long. Can we cut them in half and have one? Some rods go to the first and then from there continue down to the second floor walkway. Bottom line was, in order to do that, you needed to make some engineering changes so that the joints would work. And that was not done because the engineer who designed it said, it's okay the way it is. So there wasn't a detailed analysis for the new design. So it was pathetic because if you look at the forces for like 3 seconds, you can see that wouldn't work the way they wanted to do it. So anyway, that had a big influence on laws regarding engineering and on professional engineering standards. And it's taught to every engineer. It's one of those standard things. And there's a couple other cases like that. Each case has its own nuance. But I think there's not a company out there, well, I shouldn't be so glib. There needs to be some kind of redundancy when you're designing a critical thing where somebody could die if it doesn't work. People's work needs to be checked and double checked. And that wasn't as big of a requirement before Hyatt Regency as it was after. Also, the liability, I think, side of it has been increased. You don't just lose your license.
Yeah.
you could go to jail.
Well, that's with the Challenger, though. Was anything done illegal? That's what I think is interesting, is that a lot of times people think if they're just following all of the rules, then they're doing the right thing. But there is not always an overlap between the ethical thing to do and what the law says. And especially when it comes to technology, technology outpaces existing law. So if you're just following the laws that exist, that might not hold with new technology. So when it comes to the Challenger disaster, as opposed to the Hyatt, was anything done that was illegal?
Apparently, they didn't think so.
Okay.
You know, it's interesting you asked that question.
Thank you.
Because I asked that question of one of the members of the Rogers Commission. The Rogers Commission was created to investigate the disaster. And one of the members of the Rogers Commission was Chuck Yeager. And I ran into Chuck Yeager at a function once. I happened to be talking to him one-on-one. And I said, how come nobody was sent to jail for that? And turns out Chuck Yeager was campaigning to send somebody to jail. He thought that was that egregious. But he said everybody else said, no, these were just engineers and managers that made a mistake. And so nobody got punished. Nobody lost their job. But I think that it did set the stage for things later on that made those kinds of mistakes where they had more criminal liability, especially in cases where there's a famous safety case in Los Angeles where it was one of the first cases where somebody in management went to jail. And it had to do with people working in tunnels weren't supposed to be able to smoke and do anything that could ignite a fire from gases or anything. Apparently, some work had been done and people had been cited a couple of times for violating this. They had a fire and some people died. And I don't know if it was the president of the company or some upper management actually went to jail. You needed to have some of those incidents to where upper management realized that they weren't untouchable. Now, was that a direct result of the Challenger? No, I don't think it was. But I think the public has cried out for more and more concern about safety.
It's interesting for me because a lot of times we treat university courses like if you're majoring in this, then why do you have to take a GE? Like it has nothing to do with my major. But really, when you step back with something like engineering and philosophy, what Phil, you and I have teamed up to teach this course on engineering ethics, you can see how they really do need each other. Like if we have an idea have an idea of what does it mean to be excellent? What does it mean to enjoy your life? What is the value of knowledge, of curiosity? And all of that can be informing engineering decisions, because a lot of times when I ask the engineers, it'll be on the first day, I'll say, what is the function of engineering? What makes an engineer? So all the different types of engineers, can we come up with some sort of a conclusion? And eventually the students get to make life better. And then I say, okay, well, we have to say, well, what makes life better? Is it something that's easier, or what is it? And when we have an idea of what makes life better, then we can move forward with engineering design. Because if you don't have a concept of that, then the designs don't even make any sense. They're the result of somebody's vision. With the Challenger, I suspect it's now illegal to not inform astronauts, right?
Yeah, the informed consent now is, I believe there's laws about it. And that is if, in fact, I recently had to quote that for something I was involved with. But yes, basically, if you are affected by something in the public or private domain, then either you or somebody who represents you is supposed to be informed. So it may not be you that is directly informed, but maybe your HOA is informed, or your city is informed, or somebody that represents you is informed. Your union is informed. And so, yes, I think that is now considered to be, quote unquote, the ethical thing to do. And I want to add, you said, what do we tell engineers on the first day or ask questions about? There's always been students walking into our class thinking, oh, I don't need this class. It's not an engineering class. Why do I need ethics? I know the difference between right and wrong. I don't need this class. So I address that. I tell my students, I say, look, I have 50 years of experience, engineering and higher education, 10 years as an engineer for General Motors, 40 years in education, 27 years on a school board, I've been in management in all three sectors. And let me tell you, all of the major problems I've had in those 50 years have had nothing to do with the quality of my work. It's all been ethics related. Some students understand what I'm trying to say, and then I give them a video to watch where I have 9 different incidents, ethics incidents, that I relate to them. None of them had to do with engineering. It all had to do with loyalty, conflict of interest, all kinds of issues that are ethics related, but not actual engineering design problems. So by the end of the course, I think a lot of them kind of get it, because you can get caught in the middle of something that you had you weren't the cause at all, but all of a sudden you're in the middle of dealing with a moral dilemma. And what are you going to do?
Let me ask a very difficult question as somebody who works in the space of government finance. And I understand that there's only a finite number of revenues, notwithstanding our federal government's spitting out dollar bills over and over again. We're not going to get into that kind of a discussion. So in your courses or in these engineering ethics courses, does cost analysis come in? Does, but at what price come into the discussion? I'm not advocating for that. I'm just wondering if you guys get to that level of it, right? Because you can make the safest space shuttle in the world for probably $10 trillion. Right? Everything assumes some level of risk. If you try to account for every single, well, what if this happens or what if that happens? Well, let's build this, let's build that, let's build this. We won't actually make any progress as human beings. Because if we're always trying to counterbalance against safety, like we always have to take some measure of risk and then iterate and figure out, well, that was too risky. We should have spent more time. We should have done more safety stuff. But I'm just curious, as ethical professors, what do you talk about with your students with respect to costs?
Well, that's a huge topic. It's a major topic. What we tell our students is when you're an engineer, you will always be faced with 2 things on a project: cost and schedule. Getting it done on time and getting it done with whatever the budget is or a reasonable amount of money. So the question is, how much do you spend on safety? How far do you go? The students have kind of some misconceptions about that. They're thinking, well, why don't we test things more? Why don't we double check? Why don't we do all kinds of things like that? Well, there's some things that you don't, double check, or things that you can't test. The actual thing you're doing is the test of it. But what can you do to minimize risk? And how much do you spend? I have my students interview somebody from industry about ethics, and they have to ask safety questions among all the other questions. One of the questions they ask is, how important is safety, or how much would you spend on safety? They generally find out that companies are willing to spend money on safety, because if they have a disaster or a problem, that could cost them mega times more than what the safety measures would have cost. And also the damage, and could be loss of life or injury. So that is a big deal. And the engineer's challenge is to minimize risk and try to do it economically, if that's possible, and to try and meet schedule. But sometimes, and this is another point, is sometimes you have to actually say, this is too risky. We shouldn't be doing this. We can't guarantee the public safety. If you're in a situation where you're a minority in that and you feel that people are going to do something wrong, that's when you have to make a lot of decisions about what you're going to do. Roger Beaujolais, the engineer I mentioned from the Space Shuttle, he went around for years after the Space Shuttle disaster talking to engineering students at colleges about that whole situation. So what are you going to do? That is a big topic. Some of the students interview people who claim they left the company because they felt the company was not doing things properly. They actually quit or moved on.
Yeah, that's what sometimes the students will say, your hands are tied. This is what the company wants. And I say, no, you can leave. You can say, I'm not going to be a part of it. That doesn't mean it's an easy decision. Suggest that you have your hands tied, it's like, no, actually you have the freedom to say this. But what's interesting is Richard Clark, he's the one who's, I guess, credited with having predicted September 11th. And he wrote a whole book called Warnings, and it was called The Cassandra Effect. And he talked about the Challenger, and his whole book was about people coming forward with data, with numbers. Like what happened with the Challenger? It's like, here's the O-rings, here's the temperature. These are the numbers. It's not going to work. And Richard Clark was saying that over and over again, what happens is if people have not experienced what you're talking about, the numbers, they just fall on deaf ears. And so it's like with when he came forward with September 11th, predicting it, nothing like that had happened before. So they just didn't take it seriously. And same thing, it's like with the O-rings and the temperature. It's like, here we have the data, but if they haven't experienced it before, they have a hard time reconciling the logic, the numbers with their experience.
Sure. If a person has done something unsafe 100 times without being injured or killed, they get lulled into a belief that the risk is super, super small or non-existent. And yes, then they become reckless. When I teach safety, that's one of the things we talk about is the feeling that you're going to be okay because nothing's happened before.
Well, to Rudy's point, maybe if we do like a bit of a time hop here, since we're going back to the 80s, we can go back about a decade before. And this cost-benefit analysis, this is just extraordinary. I would have given anything to be a fly on the wall for this conversation. But this is the Ford Pinto. when the engineers said, hey, this thing explodes on impact, it was something like 30 miles per hour because of the gas tank was vulnerable. And the engineers came to Ford and said, we have 6 different solutions to solve this. And Ford said, you know what? It's probably cheaper to do a wrongful death suit than to fix the car. And so they did a cost-benefit analysis. And for our listeners out there, the reason why they said wrongful death suit is because if you were hit in the Ford Pinto, you would die in the Ford Pinto because the doors would jam shut when it exploded. And so they made that analysis, but it's to your point, Phil, it's like, well, wait a minute, this is the risk we're talking about is human life. At that point, the numbers just, it doesn't make any sense to kind of quantify things in that way.
Yes. And a couple of those decisions in the auto industry has cost them billions of dollars in lawsuits. Billions. They had a kind of I don't know where they came up with something like $300,000 was the cost of a lawsuit, but it would cost a lot more than that to re-engineer the car or something like that. Yeah, it was awful. And Ford wasn't the only one that did that then. I think that a lot of the more recent, the rollovers, the Ford Explorer rollovers, I think was another example of that. Where they were aware that could happen, but they didn't want to spend the money to deal with it.
Well, Phil, I know that you have technically retired, but I'll be on Cal Poly and I still see you. So you keep coming back to teach these classes. So I want to know, there must be some joy there. What do you get out? Why do you keep coming back to teach this class in particular?
Well, I think I still have a lot to say, and I think I still have a lot of wisdom to impart on my students, the ones that want to hear it. And I like teaching. I like teaching the ethics class and my finance class. And I can still travel and, live out of state when I want to and stuff. So, but to answer your question is, I just feel like I have a lot to share. That keeps me coming back. About 2 or 3 years ago, a 4-episode series came out called Challenger Final Flight. And I've watched the series twice. It's very well done. What makes it good is it is all interviews of people who were there. It was the engineers that are still alive were interviewed, the family members of the astronauts, other people that were involved, the engineers, including Larry Malloy. I'm not in the Larry Malloy fan club. And Alan McDonald was interviewed. And I've talked to Alan McDonald twice and Richard C. Cook once, and they shared with me things that they never had said in writing. I think that you will, if people are interested in this at all, Challenger Final Flight. It's very well done. Like I said, it's all real people. Krista McAuliffe's family, all those people.
I'll link that in the show notes. Thank you, Phil. And good luck on your book. We're also going to link that in the show notes. So remind everybody of your wonderful book.
Oh,
thanks, Phil.
Oh, thank you.
Good is in the Details is produced by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske and Rudy Salo. Remember, you can check out our Patreon, patreon.com/goodisinthedetails to get extra content and support the pod. Get a shout out from us. We're also taking sponsors, so send us an email, goodisinthedetailspod@gmail.com. And we'd also like to thank our sponsor for this episode, avonmoreinc.com. It's that bridge business you've been hearing me talk about, a small business that started in the 90s and ended up to being a global sensation amongst the bridge community. If you have friends who play bridge, your family, or if you play bridge, you gotta check out avonmoreinc.com. They have everything for your next bridge party. Smart playing cards, which are also great for kids, coasters, tallies. You're gonna love it. avonmoreinc.com, and let them know that Good is in the Details sent you. You can check us out on Instagram, Good is in the Details Pod, and on Facebook. Okay, until next time, bye.